Welcome to the Connected podcast, a new series that explores issues within the higher education community through conversations and reflections with guests, helping us to stay connected. In Series 1, we speak to educators from across the higher education sector to get their thoughts on all things connected to relational pedagogy. In today's episode, I'm joined by Dr Pablo Dalby. Pablo is an award-winning educationist and recently received a National Teaching Fellow Award. Pablo specialises in inclusive teaching for social transformation. Today he talks with us about bias and inequality in the context of higher education and introduces us to his signature power-centred pedagogy, aptly named Powergogy. Very warm welcome to Pablo. Thank you so much for joining me for our conversation together today.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Yeah, super excited to get chatting about all things related to kind of navigating bias in this landscape in higher education. I'm really thinking about the power and the power that we hold as educators and where that might, become tricky. But before we get going, do you just want to introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us a little bit about you?
Absolutely, thanks. I'll do three things. I'll talk about my job a little bit at the moment, my current role. And then secondly, I'll give a sensory and social identities description, which I think is an inclusive thing to do. And then thirdly, I'll just talk a bit about how I communicate. So I'll communicate about communication, which I think is helpful.
Perfect.
So number one, my current role, I work as the inclusive education tutor at UEA. That's the University of East Anglia. And basically, I provide training, guidance and support to staff to help them enhance their inclusive practice. In terms of a sensory and social identities description, I think this is inclusive because some people, I may not be visible to some people, for example. So I'll give a sensory description of what I look like. And then I'll talk a bit about some of my social identities that I feel comfortable sharing. And the reason I'm doing that is because I think if people feel comfortable sharing it, it can be helpful to raise the topic of how all of us are positioned in social power structures based on our identities. And that can help us start more discussions about power, which is what I like to do.
Great.
And so, basically I am 6'2". I'm bald. I've got a beard. I've got blue-grey coloured eyes, a bit of a wonky nose, and I'm wearing a brown shirt today. And I'm also, in terms of my social identities, I'm a white, middle-class, middle-aged, British, cisgender, heterosexual man. And I live with some mental health difficulties. So specifically, I've got a form of OCD. So obsessive compulsive disorder, as it's called. I don't like that term disorder, but that's how people refer to it. And that leads me to a bit about how I communicate. So I do try to be clear and concise, but my inclination sometimes is to get into the detail. I'm quite thorough. So I can get into conditionals and caveats and all the rest of it. And to be honest, this really reflects how I see reality, for want of a better word. The world we live in, I think it's complex, it's messy, it's comprised of partial truths. And I think there's a risk that we oversimplify that. And I think that happens a lot. We take something really complex and we oversimplify it with generalizations, blanket statements, and I don't think that's helpful. So I'll try to find a balance between being concise but also respecting that complexity.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Pablo. I feel that the listeners are really going to be able to kind of connect with you for sharing that information. And I think it's really really helpful, as you say, if we're feeling comfortable with sharing a little bit about ourselves to help us feel connected and understand perhaps some of our perspectives and where we're coming from with some of our viewpoints because
Definitely.
of who we are and that identity that we hold. So thank you for sharing. firstly, as we get cracking, I just
Mm,
wonder how you might define kind of bias in the context of kind of your own work or kind of that broader higher education landscape, and what kind of specific biases you might feel are kind of prevalent within that landscape as well, or things that you've maybe seen, or had to challenge specifically within higher education.
absolutely. So, bias is often used to refer to this idea that people might have preconceived notions or prejudices that might influence decision making and interactions and expectations. That's, I think, how many people might understand bias. I would take it further. I'd say bias is a product and a producer of power. And what I mean by that is, I don't mean the kinds of power simply that charge a smartphone, for
Yeah,
example. I'm talking about the relations and systems and structures of power that, frankly, shape everything about our world and our diverse experiences of it, including higher education. And a key point here is that I think there's a risk that some people see bias as isolated instances where people exercise their subjective selective preferences, okay, and that some people think that those are isolated instances that happen against a backdrop which
mm,
is broadly objective.
hmm,
So this idea that, a lot of what happens in higher education or out in the world is objective, and that's a good thing. But we have this problem of bias, these little instances of bias, and that's a negative thing. I think bias isn't positive or negative innately. It depends how we engage with it.
yeah,
But I do feel that that approach to bias is prevalent in higher education.
yeah,
So really, I could go quite meta about this, if you know what I mean. So kind of refer to the idea that we're talking about, and say that that's a bias towards how bias is understood, that
yeah,
people think of it in this way. And I think, this depends on the context, of course. So, for example, in higher education, in some disciplines, like in the social sciences, it's become now widely accepted that, for example, well, widely accepted by many people, that humans can't be objective. Like, we are subjective beings. Everything we're involved in is biased, if you like. That's because everything that humans are involved in is produced through decisions, through a decision making process that humans are involved in, right? And
yeah,
so when we make this, we're making decisions every second of every day, right? And we're making choices from a much broader field of possible choices that we could make. Some of those choices we're consciously aware of, and some of them we aren't. But we're choosing paths from a wider pool of paths, and that involves being selective. And, you know, how do we make those decisions? Um, we make them because we draw on all of the influences and forces and factors that make up who we are as people, right? Emotions, upbringing, values, etc. What Whether I've just had something to eat or not, and whether I'm feeling satisfied or if I'm hungry, all of this changes the kind of decisions we make. So it's all biased. That's the key point.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it, how then that influences, who we are and the way that we teach and how we show up in the spaces at work and at home and within life.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. These are all
And I,
expressions of who we are.
yeah, absolutely. And so I wonder then, in what ways perhaps expectations differ for students based on kind of how we perceive their backgrounds or their abilities, and how I guess as educators we can fall into that trap.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I can talk a bit here about some general types of bias and how they're prevalent everywhere, including HE, and then maybe some like specific biases in HE, not exclusive but specific. See, people may be aware of various categories of bias, if you like. So, yeah, we've touched on already the idea of unconscious bias or implicit bias, the idea that some of our preferences may be unconscious to us. We may not be aware that we have them. So, for example, an educator might look towards certain students with certain sets of social identities when they're asking particular questions. There's been research done to show that, for example, teachers will often look at who they perceive to be boys if they're asking, or men, if they're asking questions around science or engineering or technology, for example, and not people that they perceive to be girls or women. And there are various other categories of bias. So confirmation bias, the tendency to kind of favor information that confirms our existing beliefs. So, for example, if you have a particular set of expectations about particular, students with certain social identities, you might be much more likely to observe and remember things about them if it reaffirms your pre-existing bias about those students, and forget stuff that contradicts your theory, if you like.
Yeah.
So there's all of these categories of bias, if you like. But I think also I'd like to talk about some really fundamental biases, if you like, in higher education. I'm using biases because that's the term we're using. I'm talking really about the products of power relations, right? And the producers of more power relations. But I think in HE, for example, and more broadly, there's communication bias, which in many cases is ableist. In other words, it's based on specific ideas held by a specific group of people about what normal communication is. So let me give you some practical examples. In higher education, we favour certain forms of communication above others in particular contexts. So certainly in the past, but still today, if you're doing a synchronous session, in other words, like teaching a seminar or a lecture or whatever, some experience in real time, speaking verbally, as we are now, is apparently, the main or the only means to communicate in some cases. Also there's a bias towards the idea that we expect someone to have the capacity to communicate their thoughts on the spot, if you like, verbally, at a particular moment in time. So, when they're asked to do something in front of other people, they have to show what they know within that time frame. And this is all reflected, of course, in many ways how we design assessments. That it's easy for educators to confuse the idea that we're assessing, for example, what students know or what they can do, with the idea that actually what we're doing is assessing what they know or they can do in that particular context. That's all we're doing under the conditions of the assessment that we've designed. That is not the same thing as assessing what students know or can do, for example. And we have to remember that. So for example, when it comes to assessment, generally speaking, writing has been the main means to communicate in assessment. Not in all assessments, of course. And things are changing gradually as we start to diversify assessment and modes of communication. And that's a good thing. But the bias is still there, and it's been there a long time. I don't know if you wanted to come in on that at all.
There's so much that just sings to my heart with what you were saying then, Pablo. Obviously, as a speech and language therapist by trade, that notion about communication and particular forms being, if you like, preferred or deemed more acceptable or better than others, definitely chimes. And I think we just forget the pace and how automatic communication is for so many people, and how quickly we do manage it when we are kind of efficient communicators. But for people that do have any of those difficulties or any additional needs in any lots of different ways, that becomes so much more challenging. And even just pressurizing the system by introducing an assessment component or an anxiety because it's somebody new or it's a big audience, or so many different variables that are so individual for lots of different people,
Yes.
really tip that balance. And again, so much then links back to, and I'm going to shut up so that you can carry on talking to
No,
this.
it's interesting.
But so much of it then goes back to, doesn't it, that power balance of actually, if you have somebody with or without communication difficulties, who feels comfortable and in a balanced sort of power relationship and is asked to do something and has been given that time and prep, then that's going to be far more successful for that person than if that balance has been tipped. So yeah, that's lots and lots of stuff. You chimed with me there.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting and absolutely goes back to things we've talked about a lot before around providing options. That's one of the keys to accessible, inclusive practice. Recognizing that people are diverse, they've got diverse needs and preferences, and so we need to provide a diverse range of ways for people to communicate and do whatever we're doing in higher education. And I would just reiterate again that all of these specific examples I'm giving, hopefully they're useful to illustrate the point. But the broader point I made earlier is that we can't be objective per se. Humans can't be. Every single choice we make, and that includes choices that we're not making, if you know what I mean. Because by choosing one path, you can't take all the paths at the same time. All of those things have implications, knock-on implications, consequences that are in many cases interconnected, and in many cases have unintentional consequences. So there isn't anything that we can do to avoid that. That's part of being human, and that's fine. But I think personally that we should abandon the idea of thinking that we can be objective or even trying to be objective, and instead start to embrace our own subjectivities, just lay out all of our biases on the table, discuss them, examine them, share them with each other, see how they fit together, try to see what the implications are, and then see everything from different perspectives, try to achieve a kind of balance, but that's not the same as impartiality or objectivity, and then work with that and just embrace it and see how we can create the most effective, inclusive learning experiences out of all of those subjectivities and biases, if you like, rather than trying to pretend they don't exist or avoid having them. It's impossible.
Yeah. No, I hear you. And I'm just wondering, because obviously you've given us some great examples there around bias, but I'm just wondering whether there's anything particular around kind of expectations and how kind of perhaps your expectations have shaped kind of your own practice in the past, or kind of maybe you've had to really maybe examine one of those biases to kind of establish a better relationship for a student.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I've been on a journey like everyone else in terms of deepening my understanding of these issues and issues around inclusivity and inclusive practice, for example. So I've been teaching over 30 years. And of course, at the beginning, I did many of the things that we are critiquing right here. And learned over time to change them and gradually provide more and more options. So, for example, in terms of my own practice, mirroring some of the biases in higher education, there was a time when I placed too much emphasis on what was visible to me versus what was invisible. In other words, there's a bias towards visibility. In other words, people make a lot of assumptions about what they see someone else doing. For example, someone else's body language, facial expressions, and they connect those assumptions with a set of criteria that they've learned to make meaning out of it. And we have to critically ask where that criteria comes from.
Mm.
It's produced by power. It's produced by powerful social norms, dominant ideas again about what is normal. So, for example, yeah, I hear many educators in higher education, for example, talking about, I don't know, how they want to go back to in-person teaching because it was much better, because they could see whether students were learning and whether they're engaged with the learning. They could tell by their facial expressions. Were they making eye contact? Are they nodding? Are they looking at them? And these are just proxies that people have created in their minds that they think tells them what students are learning or if they're learning. And of course it doesn't. They're ableist social norms about how people interact. So some people don't make eye contact. Some people don't like to. Some people are unable to. They find it very difficult to make eye contact. Some people might focus better by doodling when someone's speaking. I'm sometimes like that myself. I sometimes find it easier to listen to what someone's saying if I'm not looking at them in the face, because I get distracted by visual elements. So all of these things. And so for me personally, learning all of this has shaped my practice and made me provide more options in my teaching. That's one example. I think other examples involve biases that I, of course, brought to my teaching based on my experiences as a student. And personally, and this is, a common critique, right? In terms of educators, like there's an idea that we tend to teach in the way that we learned or the way that we like to learn. And I think the same was true of me. So, I never liked sitting in a lecture theatre and listening to someone talk for 2 hours. I preferred interactive activities, discussions, debates. And so I tried to teach like that. And I think I expected or anticipated that students would also enjoy that. And that I was being, a fun, dynamic teacher by not talking at them for 2 hours. And I still do believe in that. And there is research to back that up, right, around active learning. But,
Yeah.
what does that mean? Research to back it up. We need to question evidence, because there are many reasons why research is also biased
Yeah.
around social norms and all the rest of it. It's all created by people through particular lenses. But in any case, my point is that, I realized that certainly many people don't like that kind of active approach to learning, or they say they don't like it. Whether or not it's more effective for their learning is another question, but some people express preferences that they don't like that. And so, to be honest, I've also changed my practice in some ways more recently during COVID. I spent, 25 years developing active learning techniques, and actually, in many ways, over COVID, I've tweaked that slightly, because I also realized that in the context we're working in, people are exhausted.
Yeah.
They don't have a lot of time. And I noticed this in myself. Like when I go to an online webinar or something and someone says, we're going to do active learning, I'm like, oh no. I just want you to tell me some stuff, while I get on with something else and take the learning from it. So I started to realize there was a contradiction, almost a hypocrisy to some extent. And also a lot of the work I do today is with staff. So staff are the learners, if you like, in my work. So in particular, I realized that staff are overstretched. So I've adapted my practice and expectations in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, that's just kind of something for us all to hold in mind, isn't it? That the journey goes on forever. And we can feel so empowered and like, yes, this is great. This is working really well. And then the landscape changes, or, the population that we're working with changes, or there's new evidence. Or so we're having to be flexible and adaptable all the time, right? And the tech
Absolutely.
the technology platforms that we use are constantly evolving as well. So, there's different ways for us to be, really quite effective, in my opinion, in the way that we teach online. And
Yeah,
for some learners, that works really, really, really well. But again, there's everybody's going to have a different opinion based on their own preferences and experiences, and how they learn and how they want to teach. But I think it's always good to keep that conversation going, isn't it, about of how we can kind of keep things improving.
absolutely.
Yeah. So how do you think then that expectations, and perhaps maybe too high or too low, or that, whatever those expectations from educators might be, how that does that influence kind of students' kind of performance, their motivation, engagement? How can that affect our students?
I think in so many ways, I couldn't give a straight answer across all groups. It really depends on the context, the type of student. I think, as I mentioned before, everything educators do has an influence. Having high expectations of students, I mean, it depends what we mean by expectations, right? Do we mean expectations of, how students will interact in a space, expectations of like their outcomes, their results, if you like. But I think, it can work to enhance student motivation and enjoyment and experience and performance. I think it can also work the other way. It depends on the context, and it really depends how you do it. It depends how well you support and scaffold and sequence the experience for students, and the quality of the relationships that you build up with them. I mean,
Yeah.
we're human beings. Teaching and learning is a social experience.
Yeah. 100%. And I think it's that's the key point, isn't it, that I think is important for us to take away, is it's kind of thinking about for each kind of relationship between educator and learner, how is that relationship, how is that power balance, what are the expectations on both sides, and is there kind of that reciprocity in that relationship, so that it's a bit,
Absolutely.
I think I described it when I was talking to a student this week, a bit like a tennis match where you're kind of serving and
Yeah.
returning, and you're waiting to see what you get back, and then you kind of change your position, or you might change how aggressively or passively you play.
Yes. Absolutely. And no, you're absolutely right. And I think perhaps for some people, when they hear the term like expectations, yeah, they might immediately think the expectations that staff have of students. But as you said, this needs to be a reciprocal relationship, in my opinion. So we need to think also about the expectations that students have of staff and of their peers, of the institution, and try to arguably align those expectations with clear
Yeah.
communication with people.
Yeah. And it very much feels that sometimes, the expectations, perhaps in the way they've been delivered or miscommunicated, or just received by, students, can just feel that there's just too much pressure.
Yeah.
And then that really feels like that doesn't work well.
Yes. Absolutely. I mean, I think, yeah, and I think I can give an example of a case from my teaching where that happened to a certain extent, but I managed to turn it around through providing that scaffolding. So one of the approaches that I've developed as part of this kind of power-centered pedagogy that I've developed called Powergogy, which is, I can talk more about that in a moment, but it's essentially about placing attention to power relations at the heart of teaching and learning. Attention to power. So that means power in the process of teaching and learning, but also the content, depending on the context. So I've developed a framework with different ideas and values, and also practical activities. People can check a link in the description to this video if they want to find out more about Powergogy, because I won't go into it in great detail today. But for example, one of the practical activities from that framework I've called revolving roles. And this basically involves creating roles for learners to perform, if you like, to enact in learning in such a way that they become the facilitators of their own learning and each other's learning. They lead the space, if you like. They lead the learning environment. And one time I tried this. I was facilitating a series of seminars for master students, and early in the module, I went to introduce this new approach to them. And some students were excited. And so I introduced the expectations of them, which was that they would be leading their own experience. I'd be a participant. I'd be a guide by the side, if you like, in the session. But I'm not going to be standing at the front like the sage on the stage. They're going to be leading it. Some of them were excited. Some of them were confused. Some of them were scared, actually. In fact, I did later find out that one student dropped out of the module after they heard about that. So
Blimey.
that's something to bear in mind. I tried to introduce it in such a way that was supportive, but I might learn some lessons for next time. But other students I know were apprehensive. Some of them approached me saying, "I'm not sure about this." One student, for example, did not feel confident. Going back to the point we made earlier, speaking verbally in front of other people. And, one of the activities that we had in their role groups potentially involved that. But again, this is about how you do it. So, of course, I spoke to the student, reassured them that there's various options for how they could communicate, not just speaking verbally, but also I said, if you're interested in working through the process of developing your confidence and competencies, capacities for speaking verbally, I can signpost you to support from student services, for example. The key thing is, whether they're interested in doing it. I think that's really important. We had a bit of a discussion around why that might be a good idea, why that might be a positive thing for them, and why it might not be. But in the end, they decided to do that. And by the end of the module, they spoke to me and said that it was fantastic. They really developed their confidence and skills. Unanimously, by the end of the module, the feedback was great, and students really came to see the benefit of that participant-led approach. But certainly, like, all of our expectations changed in many ways over that experience. Yeah.
That sounds so interesting. And I think it's really exciting, actually, when you kind of, it felt like you kind of gave the option of power back to the students there. And then the learners had kind of the opportunity to really think about what that meant for them and in that space, whether that felt comfortable or not. And I think that's, really exciting. And I think as well, there's something very key, isn't there, as us as educators being very attuned to our individual students and then thinking, is this appropriate, for us to look at, how I can support them in this space? So thinking about perhaps a hierarchy of steps to get them from, A to B or to C or what have you, or whether actually within this space, perhaps we need some additional support. So signposting, as you mentioned there, to, those wider kind of student support services. But what I think came across, and I think, again, we're going to keep using this word power, aren't we? But what seems powerful for the learners is that there is the option and the opportunity for that kind of balance, and there's the option and the opportunity for how far or how they take that forward. So that kind of individual choice within that space, which sounds really exciting.
Absolutely, yeah, and that is part of the essence of that Powergogy approach. There are many elements of the framework, but in short, it's about trying to create with students a kind of microcosm in the learning space of the world you would like to see outside in society, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, that could look different for different people. For me personally, I would like to see a more participatory democratic society. Some people may disagree, that's fine. I'd like to see mechanisms for more people taking part in decisions that affect their lives and each other's lives. Because I personally think that's the only way we can bring about sustainable change at the scale we want to see it. I'm talking about change in inequality, poverty, injustice, etc. And so how do we get there? For me, it has to involve people changing their hearts, minds, and actions through learning. You have to learn to do those things. And so we have a chance in higher education and other educational spaces, including non-formal ones, We have a chance as educators to do that, but we have to. It's not enough to just stand there and talk about ideas. We have to be practicing to be the change we want to see, if you know what I mean.
Yep.
As Gandhi said, so if you want to see like a participatory democratic society, then why not try and create one in the classroom? And that's
Yeah.
what I'm trying to do. I mean, if you
Yeah.
don't want to see that, then maybe don't do that. But do you know what I mean? But like,
Yeah.
and so that's what I try to do. So students have the opportunity to take part in decisions about what they're going to learn, how they're going to learn, etc. And that's part of the heart of Powergogy.
Yeah, I love it. And as we said, the link to more of your resources and to the Powergogy framework will be available to
Mm,
everybody. So that's great. People can kind of explore that as well.
mm,
Um, I'm just wondering, you touched a bit on this earlier about kind of your own experiences, obviously shaping your sort of current thoughts and ideas. And I just wonder whether there was any kind of personal experience that you had as a student that kind of shaped kind of, I guess, your current view or expectations of kind of learners and that journey. And you mentioned an example there where it's like, oh, you maybe brought something that wasn't so helpful. But is there kind of are there any kind of anything else that you can that's come to mind that makes you think about how you how you show up in this space?
yeah, certainly. So I'm interested in inclusive, transformative pedagogy, right? And part of the reason for that is that I experienced like a transformative learning moment when I was a student. So I was about 21. I was at university in the US, in Alabama, actually, in Birmingham, Alabama. So like
Oh
really
wow.
important spot in the civil rights movement out in the States, right? Where Martin Luther King wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail.
Amazing.
Um, and I was taking a seminar on representations of race in the media. And our teacher, our lecturer, did an activity where she just put a plaster on the table and asked us to make observations about it. I mean, like a sticky plaster that you use to cover a cut.
Yep.
And all of us were just confused what's going on. And then she pointed out that, at least at that time, this was back in the 90s,
Mm.
plasters pretty much only come in that one color, that one skin tone, if you like, that
Okay. Yeah.
seemingly is designed to blend in with a
Yep.
particular skin tone, which is
Flesh color.
white
Oh.
Caucasian. Yeah.
Yep.
And you get similar things if you look at like the labeling on stockings, for example, like flesh colored stockings. I mean, whose
Yeah.
flesh, whose
Yeah.
skin,
Exactly. Yeah.
in who's deciding, etc. So
Yeah.
it was just one of those moments where, up until that point, I thought that I was relatively clued up about some of these issues, right? Racism, anti-racism, etc. But that just blew my mind. Really, it just
Mm.
set off fireworks in my mind and got me thinking. How did I get to this point? 21 years into my life, where I'd just seen a plaster as this like just politically neutral, if you like,
Mm.
household object. And suddenly I realized that it was just symbolic. It's saturated with power,
Yeah.
with ideas, biases, prejudices. Um, and it just got me thinking, well, if I could have that kind of epiphany, that transformative moment about a plaster, what else about my life and our world could I
Yeah.
have that, you know, realization about? And then I started to realize that actually it was much easier to find things that weren't shaped by power because there isn't anything. And so I started to analyze everything, like the way from the way streets are laid out to all this stuff, and in whose interests have these decisions been made, whose interest does it serve, who does
Yeah.
it exclude, who does it marginalize, all the rest of it. But in terms of your question, I think it experientially made me feel that it is possible for educators to deliberately facilitate transformative learning, even in a second. And that inspired me massively. And subsequently, I got interested in transformative pedagogy and transformative learning, and it helped bring me to where I am now with my interest in power.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, it's just amazing, and you are such an inspiration, and I feel incredibly privileged to be able to work with you at UEA.
Thank you.
I think, I think the listeners are all going to be ready to click on your links to find out more about Powergogy. But I could talk to you all evening, Pablo. But I'm going to let you. I'm going to let you go so you can get some tea because, as always, I've snaffled you at the end of the day. So I just want to say a huge thank you for sharing your insights and thoughts with us, and giving us some very provocative ideas to think about as we navigate through kind of our idea of bias and what this means to us as educators. So thank you ever so much for your time.
Thank you for your time. You're an inspiration to me as well, doing all this work and all the other things you've done around communication access. So yeah, I appreciate your time as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pablo.
Nice one. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the Connected podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe so you don't miss our next conversation. Stay connected.